Please don't take my children!
How have you been feeling? Have you been sleeping any better?
Oh, rough. Then again, I never slept well before this condition.
Condition? It's called pregnancy. It's okay to say it out loud. Something's happened.
Can you just please drive?
Did you see something?
Come inside! What's going on?
People describe seeing an entity that takes on the form of your worst fears.
Oh my God.
What are you looking at? What did you see? What is wrong with you? Please stop it!
We can't stay here.
Every contact we have had with the outside has brought us death.
Your kids, they deserve hope.
Every single decision I have made has been for them.
They're gone.
Listen to me. We are going on the trip now. It's going to be rough.
Hold on!
If you hear something in the woods, you tell me. If you hear something in the water, you tell me. But under no circumstance are you allowed to take off your blindfold.
Do you hear that? The creatures.
Don't accuse the clouds of making aesthetic mistakes. So really is a certain light in which you can see human beings, both good and bad, as perfect forms of nature. You may have fashionable discriminations about who is beautiful and who is ugly. You may have metaphysical discriminations about who is sick and who is healthy. You may have moral discriminations about who is good and who is evil. But these are all points of view, relative points of view. They are all legitimate because they are parts of the functioning of the whole. The fact that you take those points of view, that too is part of nature. But a skillful person lives on two levels at once. You live basically on the level where you know there are no mistakes. Can't be. Everything moves in accordance with what the Chinese call the Tao, the way of nature. And if you have that basic feeling, you will always be sane. But you are able to comprehend within that feeling a more restricted point of view, whereby things are good and bad. Just as in the confines of this room and this area, it's perfectly clear that there's a difference between the up direction and the down direction. But we know that this area is situated in interstellar space, and there is no up and no down. Now, the second situation doesn't contradict the first. But if you have only the discriminatory point of view, if you take your fundamental stand as a being on the difference between good and evil, you get in the Christian hang-up. You have then to say that there is eternal heaven and eternal hell, that the distinction between good and evil is radical. And if you do that, you begin to suffer from a disease called chronic guilt, which is one of the most destructive emotions that anybody can have. You feel an outcast from the universe, at odds with reality itself, at odds with God. And that sends people quite mad and is responsible for a good deal of the craziness of Western civilization. It's making too much of a good thing out of the distinction between good and evil. It is an important distinction, but it's not fundamentally important. And you have to learn to admit different degrees of importance. And just say that because you can't just say that because a certain distinction isn't absolute, that it's not important. After all, your own physical formation is not absolute, but it's important. So, the situation of man in this network is to repeat the proposition, on the one hand, that he as an organism, psychophysical organism, is something that the whole cosmos is doing. That was as much of truth, I think, as there is in modern astrology, which I regard as a pseudoscience. But it is based on a very fundamental principle, that when you draw a map of a person's soul, you draw a small picture of the universe, a very crude picture. And that is the design of that person's individuality. The truth is, therefore, that your soul is something which contains your body. Your body does not have the soul inside it like a spook. And the whole cosmos is your soul. So the cosmos is doing you at the point you call here and now. Reciprocally, you are doing it. And the one depends upon the other. You have difficulty in conceiving this as a Westerner because we have all been brainwashed by several centuries of put-down theories of man. That you were the wretched little subject, and a disobedient one at that, of an eternal king. And B, that you were just a fortuitous congress of atoms in a mindless mechanism of incredible vastness. Having entertained those two theories of man and of existence for so many centuries, we are very much brainwashed into being unable to see that we and the universe are mutually causative, or to use the Chinese expression, mutually arising. Now then, a second difficulty arises in this, which requires that I bring in some ideas, first of all, from Buckminster Fuller. The principal notion of Buckminster Fuller's thought, and if you don't know this name, Buckminster Fuller is what I would call a philosophical engineer. A man who is one of the most creative minds in the modern world. He invented the geodesic dome, which is his main claim to economic fame. But beyond that, he's done a great deal of extremely fascinating thinking about the future of technology and the situation of man in the universe. And he has devised this important term, synergy. Coming from the Greek, syn, with, ergos, work. But what he means by synergy is this. that every complex organism has as a whole an intelligence greater than any one of its parts. And that every complex organism as a whole has an intelligence greater than any one of its parts. This again is a difficult idea to swallow, because he applies it to technology in this way. He is saying that the industrial natural complex in which we live is something that is going in a certain direction on its own, whether you like it or not. And that it is able to organize your behavior in a more intelligent way than you can organize it. And he believes, therefore, that the increasing complexity of the industrial complex will of itself, say, outlaw such lunacy as war. It will make it impossible. And that we shall find ourselves increasingly organized by an intelligent system that is not under our conscious direction, but will make us feel, I suppose, rather as our individual selves feel inside our bodies. He gives an illustration. The transportation communications network, aircraft, radio, television, telephone, these taken together are constituting a global net, which might be said to be something like Teilhard de Chardin's idea of the noosphere. I hope you all read Teilhard de Chardin, the famous Jesuit theologian who wrote the best of his books is The Phenomenon of Man. The Earth, which is the geosphere, from the Greek geos, geese, the Earth, then the Earth, as the geosphere, is covered with a biosphere. That is the sphere of living organisms. The biosphere, in turn, generates the noosphere, which is the communication network that we call the mind, through literature, through speech, through radio and television communication. The noosphere is slowly realized. So Buckminster Fuller is really talking about the same thing. The noosphere is the network of communication set up by technology. And so, for example, let's just take air transportation. As a result of jet planes, all centers that are in communication with each other by jet aircraft are becoming increasingly the same place. When you wake up in Tokyo, having come from Los Angeles or San Francisco, you are slightly in doubt as to where you are. Because Tokyo is an immense muddle. It's a mixture of Paris with Los Angeles, of San Francisco with Shanghai, of London, vaguely thrown in, and sort of a touch of Japan. It's a phenomenal place. But if you live in San Francisco, you realize it's becoming more like Tokyo. Because we have a tremendous inrush of Japanese culture. We have superb Japanese restaurants. You can go to sushi bars, that is to say bars for rice balls and raw fish, which are beautifully served, just like in a bar in Tokyo. And increasingly, we have supermarkets which sell Oriental, African, and Japanese goods. And I call them supermarkets for the unusual. And more people are laying down tatami mats and cooking over hibachis and using chopsticks and every kind of thing like that. So the point is that how near a place is to you is simply a factor of transportation. There are places in the United States. I was just in one, in a far out Indian area of South Dakota. It takes longer to reach than to get to Tokyo. So it's further away. That's all there is to it, for all practical purposes. So Fuller's idea is that by the year 1968, so soon, we have a one-town world. And it's coming fast. And as human beings have some problem adapting to this, because as you know, when you travel by jet, just as when you're in an elevator that drops too fast, you feel it left your stomach on the 14th floor and has taken the rest of you down to the first. So the jet aircraft leaves your psyche in London and brings your body to San Francisco. And it takes some time to catch up. All your time rhythms are thrown off. But we'll get used to it. And eventually, therefore, we must add to this, planes are very expensive. All governments have immense investments in aircraft. And to work, they must be kept flying. Otherwise, they get out of order. So they must be kept moving. That means there's also a huge tourist business, constantly interested in shuffling people all around the earth. And as a result of that, it's going to be increasingly a vested interest. And politicians will find it harder and harder to stop it in the interest of having a war. So what we are in effect reduced to at the moment, so far as wars are concerned, are experimental wars. Wars in small areas against people who allegedly don't matter very much, in order to test out our military materials and techniques. Because nobody can afford to keep a large standing army in which there are no veterans. So they must have practice. And so practice wars are carefully arranged. But increasingly, you see, they find that these practice wars rouse passions and disturb everybody in all directions, because there is no such thing as an unimportant people. And so they become increasingly difficult to carry on. So Fuller is extraordinarily hopeful about the future of mankind, because he feels that the synergy, the quality of intelligence in the total system, will overcome the folly of individuals, or of parts who are unable to act with full understanding of what's going on. And you see, this is a serious problem, so far as the individual is concerned, because today, not only is there a population bomb, there's also an information bomb. The proliferation of information about everything is so great that no individual can possibly grasp it. Not only has he difficulty in grasping it, but there is difficulty even for big committees to organize this information, to integrate it in such a way that if I need to know a certain thing, I can very swiftly find it out.
It's like one huge face and then thousands.
For an individual untrained in physics, it's very difficult to find out quickly about physics, because physics is expressed in a mathematical language which he probably has never learned to read. So the time lag in scanning, you see, all consciousness is a matter of scanning. And it takes in the totality of events in the world by a sweeping motion, like the glance of our eyes around a room. Well, it takes time to glance your eyes around the room and register what's there, if you want to remember it consciously. So what we are saying is that the intelligence of the system, the synergy, is more intelligent than any individual consciousness can be. But, of course, as a living organism, you are much more than consciousness, in this scanning sense, because you certainly don't arrange the complexities of your own brain by conscious decision. That's something that you grow. Or we could put it this way, that the intelligence of the universe grows as it grows you. But here again is another hurdle for the average Westerner, whose common sense is derived from the philosophy of science current in the 19th century, of thinking that the organization of the universe is intelligent. That seems to us to echo of theism, of God ideas where God is based on an anthropomorphic or man-like image, the old gentleman with whiskers in the sky. And of course that God is dead, beyond recall. But that's not the only kind of God. To think of the universe itself, its vast and complex organization, as being intelligent, what on earth does that mean? What do you mean by the word intelligent? Well, when you come to think of it, it's the most difficult word to define. Everybody knows what it is, but very few can say. It's like you know what love is, but just try and define it. You know what time is, but try and define that. Space. Everybody knows what space is, but it's the most difficult thing to pin down. And that's equally true of intelligence. We can see certain elements in intelligence. We can see complexity as an element of it. We can see complexity as what we call an orderly arrangement of different clusters of complexity. But again, we're using words, all of which are imprecise. What do you mean, orderly? That's practically to say it's all in order. It was almost like saying it's intelligently arranged. We recognize these things, but we are not quite sure what we mean by them. But we recognize them at once. And for example, if we begin with the pure hypothesis that we ourselves are intelligent, and let it go at that. If we're not, then nothing is. But let's, for the sake of argument, say that we human beings are intelligent. Now, if that is so, then the environment in which we live must also be intelligent. Because we are symptoms of that environment, and I don't for the life of me see how you can have intelligent symptoms of an unintelligent organization. We belong in this world. We didn't arrive here from somewhere else. We're not tourists in the universe. We're expressions of it. Like branches express the tree, or fruit express the tree. And so you will not find an intelligent organism living in an unintelligent environment. That is to say, the environment in which you live will be a system of mutual cooperation between a vast complexity of different kinds of organism. And the total balance of that makes your life possible. In other words, human life goes with, as front goes with back, an extremely complex bacteriological world, which sometimes diseases us, but most of the time assists us by its colonies, its societies, its methods of reproduction. All these complex interrelations are the which, without which not, the sine qua non of there being blood and veins and bones and intestines and all that kind of thing. That's only the bacteriological world. In addition to that, there's a world of insects, which is tremendously important to us. But the insects are extremely clever. And if you talk to a good entomologist, he will scare the wits out of you, because he will show you the most conclusive reasons why insects should ultimately take the whole planet over. Fortunately, we are not absolutely abominated by flies, because we have lots of spiders. And we have birds. And so birds and insects are mutually necessary to each other. And especially flowers and insects have an arrangement with each other whereby one could say of flowers and bees that although they look very different, they are one and the same organism. Flowers perfume and color. Bees buzz and fly around. But you can't have the flowers without the bees, and you can't have the bees without the flowers. And so you can think through relationships between every conceivable kind of organism, into which you must add things like atmosphere qualities, gas content of atmosphere, on and on and on, until you suddenly realize that what you call your mind and intelligence and your very brain and body is utterly involved with this network of other kinds of organisms existing at a special temperature in certain gases, which could only be found in certain kinds of solar system. Now then, seeing that should give every technologist pause. Because you can't go running into that situation with penicillin and DDT unless you know very well when to stop. Unless you can be very discriminating just what surplus of insects you want to get rid of without killing the other ones that are important. How to give penicillin without destroying all the stomach flora and having to build them up again with acidophilus and stuff. So this is why in the Taoist Chinese view of nature and the relation of nature to human politics, they set as fundamental the principle called Wu Wei, Wu Wei, which means non-interference. Not quite what we mean by laissez-faire, but rather close to it. That is to say, when you act upon nature, and you can't help but interfere. There is no way of isolating yourself from the world. Every time you breathe, you interfere with something. See? But the art of Wu Wei is that when you interfere, endeavor to do so by going with the grain of things. In other words, if you want to split wood, split it with the grain. Don't try to split it across the grain. And likewise, when you want to pick a fight, don't use violence, but use the other person's violence to bring about his downfall. That's judo. And that judo is applied Wu Wei. Sailing is Wu Wei. As distinct from rowing, which isn't. So then, The Taoists, you see, recognized that there is this universal organism. And they thought of the cosmos as a great organism without a boss. There is no one in Chinese philosophy making the world happening or ordering it. There is no, as it were, central principle in the middle which sends out commands to all the subordinate parts. But rather, that the thing organizes itself. Their word for nature being zran, meaning what is so of itself. So they saw the whole cosmos as a self-regulating organism, and they further saw that the individual is not merely a part of that organism. He is an expression of the whole thing. And the whole depends upon this expression, just as much as the expression depends upon it. And that was the principle of mutual interpenetration, which is called in, it's more familiarly known by its Japanese name, Jijimuge. The principle of the network. Between thing-event and thing-event, there is no obstruction. But you see, it remains to us a bit of a puzzle to say that all this is an intelligence, because we can think of all kinds of objections to it. We can think, if by some conscious science we were able to construct the universe, we would do it a little differently. We would have improvements to suggest upon mosquitoes. We would, perhaps a great surgeon might suggest that the human body be organized a little differently. We can think of dozens of things. But you find the curious thing is this. When you try to think out carefully how to improve the world, and then you realize is what the consequences of your suggestion would be, you wouldn't like all of the consequences. Hence the saying, be careful of what you desire. You may get it. And then one invites the individual, and this is one of the great things to do, to suggest another kind of universe. What kind of universe would you design if you were God? And I recommend, I'm not going to go into this because it's a long story, but I thoroughly recommend it as an exercise in thought. Model your own universe and see what comes out of it. Because I can only tell you that you will eventually discover that you will model this one. And you'll find out, you see, that it's based on certain absolutely fundamental principles, which of course includes the game of hide and seek. Now you see it, now you don't, which is vibration, which is the same thing as energy. And you've got to begin with that. But once you start with that, it implies the rest. Because all that we see around us is just a fantastic combination of black and white elements, of what the Chinese call the yin and the yang, the negative and positive forces. And it all leads to this, but in an incredible dance. So then, you have difficulty, though, of course, in seeing the world as an organism, because when you look out at the stars, you are in roughly the same situation or relationship to what you are seeing as when a physicist studies the constitution of the atom. he will make a map of the behavior of the nucleus in which there will be various rotating particles or wavicles. And you will see something which looks like a mathematical design and doesn't look like an organism. Because we expect an organism to be a kind of gooey thing with blood and flesh and wriggles and so on. So if you looked only through the microscope, you wouldn't see the organism. Well, when we look out at the rest of the universe, we are, as it were, sitting down on one of those electrons, looking through a microscope at the rest of it.